Today we're going to be taking the controls of a pair of ES44AC locomotives with 5,000 tons of freight behind them so that you can learn about how air brakes work and practice using them. Here in the cab there are two multifunction displays, or MFDs, that display information about the train as you drive. On the right-hand MFD, important information about the air brakes is shown. Air brakes on trains are complex to understand and will take time for you to become skilled at using. Your control for setting and releasing the brakes is the train brake control, available on the HUD here, and in the cab itself here. Move the train brake controller up to set the brakes and down to release them. We'll cover exactly how this works now. When you move the train brake control, you are directly affecting something called the equalizing reservoir. The equalizing reservoir normally sits at 90 psi, and as you increase the train brake control, this number will drop towards 0 psi. Watch the equalizing reservoir as we operate the train brake control. You can see how it has dropped to 85 psi quite quickly. In doing this, you've now set the target for the brakes, but I can tell you that the brakes are still not on. There is much more to this. Here we can see that the brake pipe is slowly decreasing. So let's understand what the brake pipe does next. The brake pipe reaches the length of the train and is also pressurized to 90 psi. The brake pipe is controlled by the equalizing reservoir. If the equalizing reservoir is lower than the brake pipe, then air will be let out of the brake pipe until it matches. And if the equalizing reservoir is higher than the brake pipe, then the main reservoir will be used to pump air into the brake pipe until it matches. See how very slowly the brake pipe changes? The speed that this changes is dependent on the length of the train. The longer the train, the more air there is to release to lower the pressure. The brake cylinder shows the pressure actually being applied to the brakes themselves. As air is released from the brake pipe, so air from another hidden auxiliary reservoir is released into the brake cylinder, causing the brakes to actually apply and the train to slow down. Our small 5% train brake control application has resulted in 5 pounds of drop on the brake pipe and 11 pounds added to the brake cylinder. And now that the brake cylinder is showing a figure above 0, we know that the brakes are coming on. It's important to fully appreciate just how long that small brake application took. The brake cylinder reads 0 psi for brakes released and goes up to a maximum of 65 psi when the brakes are on at their maximum. Okay, so it's taken ages for the brakes to apply, but let's see now that it takes no time at all for them to release. Once you move the train brake control, the equalizing reservoir will quickly rise back to 90 psi. The brake pipe will begin being pressurized from the main reservoir to match the new equalizing reservoir pressure. This will in turn cause the brake cylinders to be immediately vented to the atmosphere. There is no way to partially release the brakes on this train. Okay, now I'll release the brakes by moving the train brake control to 0%. So while it's charging, what happens if we make a further 5% application on the train brake control? The equalizing reservoir has dropped to the same amount. The brake pipe stops being pressurized and starts dropping back to the equalizing reservoir amount. Now that it's finished, note that the brake cylinder doesn't have the same amount of air in it. The same setting of the train brake control has given us less braking effort than before. This is because it's the amount of change on the brake pipe that matters. So, there are some key points to remember. There's nothing fast about applying brakes on a train this size, so think ahead and always be vigilant. It is always easier to lower your throttle and not exceed the speed limit than it is to try and use the brakes to correct it later. Releasing brakes happens really quickly. Recharging the braking system after an application and release also takes a while, and though you can normally apply brakes a couple of times, you should expect a long delay from releasing brakes to reapplying. Otherwise, you're going to run out of air and become a runaway. The key thing to keep in mind, therefore, is you should find the right setting for the brakes and stick with it, and that is when you can call yourself a skilled engineer. Before we get our train moving today, I've got a few more tips for you. Air brakes are hard to get used to, and in this simulation there is a difficulty adjuster with 4 difficulty levels. It defaults to the easiest setting, but you can press Ctrl-Shift-1 to make it harder and Ctrl-Shift-2 to make it easier. This means that all the timings are adjusted. Longer times to change the brakes for harder difficulties, shorter times for easier difficulties. Make good use of your dynamic brakes. When you start an incline, make a 6-pound application by dropping the equalizing reservoir to 84 psi, and then use your dynamic brakes to trim your speed. Add another pound or two as required if you find the dynamics aren't keeping up, but try to avoid overpowering the air brakes. If you find you're going to run out of air and need to release your brakes, then leave your brakes on and bring the train to a complete stop. Apply all your hand brakes and then release the air brakes. Once the system is fully repressurized, you can release all the hand brakes and then get back on your way. Repressurizing after an emergency application takes a long time because the brake cylinder will only be vented once the brake pipe is recharged above approximately 65 psi, and it will still take a long time after that for the air to be fully recharged in all the reservoirs. Okay, it's time to get moving and give this a go.